Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive on a situation that's been unfolding in South Korea. We're going to be looking at why President Yoon Suk Yeol decided to impose martial law. And it was a shock. It was the first time it's happened since the 1980s there. So, as you can imagine, it sent shockwaves through the country. We've got some excerpts here from an NPR article, and it's titled, South Korea's President Faces Calls to Resign or Be Impeached. And we'll unpack what happened, the history behind it, and why it matters, even if you don't follow South Korean politics that closely.
What I think is really interesting here is the audacity of President Yoon's move. He didn't just declare martial law, he tried to justify it. He said it was necessary to, quote, crush North Korea's sympathizing anti-state forces and safeguard the free constitutional order. Of course, these are really loaded terms in South Korea, so unpacking them is going to be crucial to understanding just how serious this all is.
Okay, so let's do that. When we talk about anti-state forces in South Korea, who are we really talking about? And why did the president think he needed to crush them?
You've hit on a really important point. You see, South Korean politics are full of tension, and much of that comes from their history. Anti-state forces is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but it's often used to target groups that are seen as sympathetic to North Korea, or they're critical of the government's policies. And in a country that's still at war, technically, with North Korea, these accusations have a lot of weight. They can be easily used against people.
So using language like that to justify martial law, that's a pretty big deal. What did this declaration mean for people in South Korea in those few hours when it was in effect?
Imagine you wake up and hear that your legislature has been suspended, and political gatherings are banned, and the media is under government control. That was the reality for South Koreans. It was a jarring shift, a sudden reminder of the country's authoritarian past when martial law was used to silence anyone who disagreed.
Wow, and that's happening in a country that is seen by many as a symbol of a successful transition to democracy. What was the public's reaction to this declaration?
Well, the South Korean people, particularly those who lived through the authoritarian rule, they were not going to stand by and do nothing. They went to the streets to resist. You can picture citizens gathering outside the parliament building. Staff and protesters are building barricades. They're physically pushing back against soldiers. It was a really symbolic act of defiance against the military.
It's incredible to think of people taking a stand like that. Sounds like they were determined to keep the democratic freedoms they had fought so hard for. But let's step back for a second. Martial law has a pretty dark history in South Korea, right?
Definitely. During the years of military dictatorship, it was used to crush any opposition. It reminds people of a time of human rights violations, political repression, the suppression of free speech.
Yeah.
For a lot of South Koreans, this declaration by President Yoon, it was like a ghost from the past they really want to forget.
So with that history, it makes sense why there was such an immediate pushback. What I don't get is President Yoon's motivation. What was he trying to do with this drastic move? It seems self-destructive, especially given all the attention it got from other countries.
That's the big question, isn't it? To understand Yoon's actions, we have to consider the pressure he was under at home. His approval rating was down to a terrible 20%. Scandals about him and his wife were all over the news, and he was constantly fighting with the parliament, which was controlled by the opposition.
It sounds like he was really feeling cornered. Was he trying to pull off a self-coup or something?
Yeah.
Like to just completely bypass parliament and take all the power for himself?
That's a theory that's been going around.
Hmm.
And it might not be that crazy. It's like this weird contradiction. It's when a leader tries to get even more power by breaking the same laws that gave them that power in the first place. It's a huge gamble, and in this case, it totally backfired.
It definitely did. The National Assembly, they annulled the martial law right away. And now he's facing calls to resign or even be impeached. You mentioned the international reaction. What's been the global response? I'm especially curious about what the U.S. thinks because South Korea is so important in that region.
The U.S. response, it's been pretty careful. At first, the U.S. Embassy told American citizens to avoid the protests, which shows how worried they were. But once the martial law was lifted, their official statements were really measured. They were relieved, but they didn't actually criticize Yoon for what he did.
It's like they're trying to do two things at once. They want to keep their alliance with South Korea, but they also want to support democracy. So what could the long-term effects of all this be, both inside South Korea and internationally?
In South Korea, things are still pretty shaky. Yoon's people and his defense minister have offered to resign. The opposition wants to press charges against him, and the economy is feeling the uncertainty, too. The value of the Korean won and stock prices have been all over the place. Investors are clearly nervous.
It just goes to show that even democracies that seem strong, they can still be vulnerable to shocks like this. But what about the bigger picture? How might this change South Korea's position in the world?
That's a key question. South Korea has worked hard to present itself as a solid democracy and a dependable global partner. This whole thing, unfortunately, kind of tarnishes that image. It raises questions about how stable their politics really are, whether they're committed to the rule of law, and whether they can handle internal conflicts without resorting to authoritarian methods.
I imagine the US and Japan are pretty concerned about this because South Korea is such a crucial ally in a region that's dealing with North Korea's nuclear program and China getting more powerful.
You're exactly right. The last thing they want is a South Korea that's unstable, especially with all the geopolitical tension right now. A weaker South Korea could make North Korea and China bolder, and that could make the region even more unstable.
It's a lot to think about, and it's important to connect this back to our listeners. Why should people care about something that might seem like just political drama happening far away?
Because the world is so interconnected now. What happens in South Korea affects everyone. South Korea is a big player in the global economy, so any instability there can disrupt supply chains. And that could mean higher prices or even shortages of things we all use. Think about smartphones, cars, electronics. South Korea makes a lot of those things.
That's a great point. So, in a way, we all have a stake in whether South Korean democracy is stable or not.
Absolutely. And it's not just about money either. It's about the fight for democratic values around the world. When a democratically elected leader tries to grab power like this, it has a ripple effect everywhere. It makes authoritarian leaders in other places more confident, and it undermines the progress we've made toward democratic governments.
So, this whole situation in South Korea is a wake-up call. It shows us that democracy is fragile and that we need to protect it not just in South Korea, but everywhere.
Exactly. And it shows how important it is to stay informed about what's happening around the world, even things that seem far away from our daily lives. Because in today's interconnected world, something happening on one side of the planet can have real consequences on the other.
This deep dive has been really insightful, but I have to say it's a bit unsettling, too, to see how quickly a democratically elected leader can try to dismantle the very system that brought them to power. It's a sobering thought. But there's also a glimmer of hope here, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. The South Korean people showed real courage. They didn't just accept this. They went out and protested. They made their voices heard. And in the end, they forced the government to back down. That says a lot about how strong the spirit of democracy is, even when things are tough.
You're so right. It reminds us that we as citizens, we got to be vigilant. We have to hold our leaders accountable and defend democratic values wherever they're under threat.
Exactly. Democracy is not a spectator sport. You can't just watch. You got to participate. You got to think critically, and you got to be willing to speak up when things aren't right. The people of South Korea, they showed us what's possible when people come together to protect their freedom.
Their actions are a powerful example for all of us. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key things you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the most important thing is to understand the history. When you know how martial law has been used in the past, both in South Korea and in other places, it helps you understand how serious President Yoon's actions were and why the South Korean people were so worried.
It also shows how important it is to stay informed about what's happening around the world. Even political stuff that seems far away can have a real impact on our lives.
Right. And lastly, I want to leave you with a sense of hope. What happened in South Korea is a wake-up call. It shows that democratic institutions are fragile and we need to protect them. But it also shows how powerful people can be when they hold their leaders accountable and fight for their freedoms.
This has been a really intense deep dive. And as things continue to develop in South Korea, we encourage you to keep learning and stay engaged with this story. And remember, the fight for democracy is a global one, and we all have a part to play in making sure it survives as empire.